So the question is how to sort of identify and what to do about a hive that is about to swarm. One thing that I think is really important for especially newer beekeepers to learn is to be able to look in a hive. So most new beekeepers can look in a hive and say, oh, it's full of bees. But to be able to look in a hive and say it's full of bees and there are 6 frames of sealed brood. To me, that kind of triggers something in my mind that says, you know what, we're getting into swarm territory here. Because what you have to realize is that's a whole lot of new bees emerging. Swarming is triggered by not only the fullness of how many of the cells are full of nectar or babies, but also just the population and congestion in that hive. And so when you have a whole lot of sealed brood, you're about to double your population, right? And then they're going to swarm. So that's how I ideally identify a hive that wants to swarm as well before it begins queen cells. If you identify them at that point, you have a lot of options. So if you say want to make nukes or want to make a split, you could go in and you could pull some of that sealed brood and bees and you could move them elsewhere. If you're a commercial beekeeper, you could go shake those bees and make packages if that's what you do. But also say that colony is a single deep. That's the perfect time to go ahead and put that second deep on it or medium or whatever you're going to use. If they're really, really full, a lot of the time I would put a deep on top of them. So it's kind of, I've answered questions of whether to put a deep and a medium or 2 deeps. So that would be a situation if they're just barely fitting in the box and they've, you know, got bees everywhere, they got resources everywhere. I would actually set another deep on top and I'd probably pull not the middle frames and not quite the outside frames. I'd pull a couple of those up to the top and I'd try to kind of reduce the congestion in that hive. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is pretty common. There's a scenario 3 when you've waited far too long, but scenario 2 is they're already starting swarm cells. So you go into a hive, your queen may or may not be laying anymore and they've got queen cells started, and a lot of them usually. In that case, usually you're beyond the point of just stacking a box on. Usually their mind is made up, they're going to swarm. Not 100%. I mean, this is kind of playing by the numbers, right? But if they got queen cells good and started, especially with a large larva in them, or if they're capped, you kind of have to go to a different route. And what I normally do with those is I will go ahead and make a split. So I'll kind of take all my resources, and that's brood and bees, and then honey and pollen, and I'll distribute that evenly. So say there's 2 boxes, I'll try to distribute that evenly, and I'll take the first one off and I'll set it down. If they're that committed to swarming, and this is a complete opinion, I mean, there will be people that will argue with me on this. If they're that close to swarming, I like to move the old queen. I just think about how a swarm would normally happen, and that's what I'm mimicking. And that old queen would leave the hive. And so I like to move her because I've found that if I leave the old queen in the original hive, especially if I make the split in the same yard, she catches a lot of drift bees. So even though you've reduced the population, it might get a little more crowded than you think, and they may still go ahead and swarm. And what you have to realize too about swarming, and I never quite appreciated this for a good while being a beekeeper, but through some experience and through actually reading some of Tom Seeley's stuff. So most bees will swarm more than once. So I hate to get into that pathway of guessing if they're done, cutting cells, that kind of thing. I'd rather go ahead and split them. And if you have to split them 3 ways, that's okay too. But I move that old queen, I mimic that swarm, and then I come back. So that's my 2 cents.